Earthlings, and welcome to the welcome to the amateur. Oh no, wait! Welcome to Nakasuchi's channel. Doing a bit of a takeover here tonight. Nakasuchi usually works on Wednesdays. He's asked me to do a once a week broadcast on Wednesday nights. Now tonight, though, he does have the night off, and you'll probably see him in live chat there. Word to the moderators, there were some meetings earlier today that maybe not everybody was there. Please follow Nakasuchi's lead in the live chat. There were some issues that were discussed.
Really quick?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so for the moderators, anybody who's got a wrench in the live chat, protocol is as such. If somebody issues a racial slur, then they immediately get timed out, and you have to let them know why, what they said that was inappropriate. You can just use the first letter of the slur if you need to. If they use a different slur, such as the R slur, then they get one warning. If they argue with you, they get a timeout. If they use the word again, they would also get a timeout. Or if they argue with you, then use the word again, they'd get a mute. But anytime, like, they do anything other than a racial slur that you're concerned about, whether it's either slurs or, like other types of slurs, or if somebody asks you for help because they feel insulted or something else, you got to let them know why, and you got to give them a warning. All right? We don't just time people out because we're annoyed with them.
Yeah, that was something that was happening. And you don't time people out just because you disagree with them. So, which I guess is annoying. So, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I want to give an extra thank you to Dragnot Silvis for finding our last minute guest, Max. He's got me rethinking that whole atheism thing, because I was literally poking around trying to find a Christian to come on to have this discussion tonight, and literally I was in the midst of doing that, and then I get a DM from Dragnot, hey, I found a Christian to come on tonight. And so as Aliyah Kai said when I told her about it, she said, thank the gods. I might have to rethink whether I might thank the gods myself. But as it said in the title, when little bear's away, the horse will play. So on Wednesday nights, I'll be doing a stream. And tongue-in-cheek, I put in the title, Big Bang or Big Daddy, because the video that I linked when in the video description and when I tweeted out about it was a broadcast on Unbelievable, in which Alex Malpass and Professor Andrew Locke, who is a professor at some Baptist organization overseas. I can't remember the exact name of it. They talked about the cosmological argument. Professor Locke seemed to be of the opinion that he had a fresh take on it. From what I watched of the video, I didn't really think he had too much of a fresh take. Barney, who's here tonight with us, he when I sent him the link, he did sorry folks.
Damn it, I feel like I'm on Nakasuchi's channel.
Yeah,
somebody
I know.
forgot to turn off their phone.
Because the phone went off, yeah. Well, and
you're an appropriate an appropriate host for Nakasuchi's.
Well, and my fault too. Just before I sent the links out to everybody, I went upstairs and had a cigarette, and I made the mistake of calling a family member, and they didn't answer, so that was them probably returning my call. So as I was saying, I sent the link to Barney a few hours ago, and then he DM'd me and said, "Oh, I'm watching it right now, and I'm taking notes." So, Dragnot has, he was the one that suggested that we talk about this video, so I'm sure he's very familiar with it. I only got to watch a little bit of the beginning of it. And Max says he's familiar with the arguments, but he only saw a bit of it. And so to start with, just want to go right down the line and have everybody introduce themselves and, maybe say a few words about the topic, and then we'll jump into it. Aliyah Kai.
Hey, so as you probably caught, this is my second time on here today. This time I'm not here talking about toxicity, obviously. So I'm a Leakai. I'm a Hellenic polytheist, specifically a Reconstructionist. So I have a slightly different viewpoint on the Kalam cosmological argument. I don't necessarily think that the existence of a prime mover is absolutely required. There are some variations on Hellenic polytheism that deal with a concept called chaos, which I'm going to do my best to explore, but it is a hell of a mouthful and a hell of a headful. So the idea of something emerging from nothing effectively is one that I'm not at all unfamiliar with. I'm also familiar with some of the God of the Gap stuff that has to do with Kalam cosmological and the way that the Big Bang Theory is said to have worked. So, yeah, my thought is that Kalam cosmological is not an absolute end-all, be-all proof for deity.
All right, Max, welcome.
Oh, thank you, and it's nice to have such a well-regarded greeting out of the horse's mouth. I'll see myself out. So my name is Max, obviously not my real name. I'm a Unate Catholic. Basically, Unate Catholics are people who are Eastern Orthodox in tradition and liturgy, like how we practice and worship, but we are in communion with the Bishop of Rome, that is the Pope. So we're Catholics in terms of who we're under in jurisdiction, but we practice just like we're Eastern Orthodox. In terms of my background in philosophy, I have taken 2 whole semesters of philosophical courses. I think that the Kalam cosmological argument, I think the first premise is pretty sound. Anything which begins to exist does have a cause. What I'm not convinced of is the second premise, that the universe is such a thing which began to exist. And if you compare it to other cosmological arguments, in the family of cosmological arguments, the Kalam is very unique in that it requires the demonstration of a beginning, whereas other forms of cosmological argument, such as the one provided by Aristotle or Leibniz, do not. So I'm far more sympathetic to those arguments than I am the Kalam.
Barney Tierspell.
Hi, I'm Barney, and I'm an alcoholic. Sorry.
Wrong meeting.
Wrong meeting. I'm Barney. I'm bunch of labels. I'm a positive atheist, ex-Catholic, a Stoic, I guess, a physicalist. I don't have formal education in any of this stuff. I'm a computer programmer by profession, but I am very interested in philosophy, in the discussions about religion, in the exchange of ideas, in science, especially physics. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
All right, and we have a little something for the ladies here tonight. Dragnaut Silvis.
Hi there, folks. Some of y'all probably already know me. Not to toot my own horn, toot toot. Excuse me, toot toot. But most of y'all already know. If you don't know, I am a biology student. In my last 2 semesters, I get my bachelor's of science in biology with a specialization in cellular, molecular, and biotechnology. I enjoy having talks like this because I suck at philosophy, but I have a respect for it because we make decisions every day. We come to conclusions, but many of us don't know how. We have beliefs and we feel really strong about them. And when it comes to some of the important questions, like why do certain people believe in a deity or deities or don't or whatever, this is one of the rare opportunities that we get to sit down and actually discuss it and say, well, what is rational? Well, and this conversation, we're going to discuss what is a cause. If you never sat down and thought about what a cause is, get ready, folks. Get ready, because this is where the rubber meets the road. And I'm going to turn off my camera in a minute because I'm going to get something else to eat. But I thank everybody for coming here because this is going to be some fun. And please, folks, if y'all have questions, ask in the chat. If we're mentioning things or concepts that you're unfamiliar with, there's lots of people with wrenches that can link resources. If not, I'll be sure to do it in between me grabbing plates of macaroni and cheese and fried chicken.
And just as an ad, we're probably going to be talking about what nothing is too, and whether or not we can even figure out how to conceptualize that.
Yeah. And thanks, Max. I just saw your note to me. Andrew, Professor Locke is a professor at Hong Kong Baptist University. So I guess to start, I think what we'll do is let's just turn it over to Barney to kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of the video, since he's the one who has watched it to completion so recently. Go ahead, Barney.
So basically the topic of the video was taking turns between Andrew Locke and Alex Malpass on the topic of God as the primary cause for existence and for the universe. Andrew opened up with the standard Thomist argument and kind of summing it up to Craig's Kalam argument, Craig's version of the Kalam argument, invoking the necessary first uncaused cause, and from there arguing that the properties of that cause as a singular, free-willed, personal, powerful creator. Malpass did basically what I would do in that conversation and went for all the interesting things, which I honestly think was a mistake as far as the format of the debate, because he seemed to be there for the conversation. So he identified everything which is contentious, which is hard to think about, which is confusing, and brought them all out on the table. And in that respect, I guess Andrew got the better of him, because Andrew was kind of appealing to the lowest level common sense. Let's just all think classically about these things that we know nothing about and never assume anything beyond that. Right? So Malpass first challenged him on the why would we discard the infinite regression?
Right, and I found that interesting myself, because that's one of the assumptions I think he was making is, I mean, right off the bat, I'm talking about Professor Locke, that you have to rule that out. But I didn't understand why.
So it's a thing in classical philosophy. All throughout the ages, that the infinite regress of causes or infinite regress of explanation has been ruled out as a practical way of thinking about things. Why? Because it necessarily disables you from having a conclusion.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Go ahead, Barney.
It's the same thing as the law of the excluded middle in logical premises. Go ahead, Drake.
I do like how Malpass kind of made this not an appeal, but he kind of set the stage at the very beginning, because I see a lot of people do this, and I know you have, Barney, and you have too, Max. When people try to defer to their own intuition as a like a meter stick for what's possible in the world, or the universe, I should say, that's where I think a lot of us kind of go wrong. And Malpass pointed to kind of, I think he called them weird, but basically weird phenomenon that we know in physics that happen that are counterintuitive. So just because of an infinite regress is counterintuitive doesn't mean that it's not possible. And I do really appreciate that he made a point of that, but I think it was kind of glossed over by Locke once he raised that point.
So
I'm sorry, Mac. I just wanted to point out real quick that on what they were talking about, because I wrote myself a little note there. Professor Locke said that the initial event must be caused by an uncaused, changeless first cause that must have free will and tremendous power. And I thought he was making an awful lot of assumptions there.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Max.
Well, just to touch on that part there, it is something you have to argue for in itself, because you have to do what's called a conceptual analysis. And a conceptual analysis does tend to bring out a lot of new knowledge. that we might not have known of when we're contemplating ideas. So take, for example, the idea of squaring the circle. Until, like, the Enlightenment, people actually thought that was quite possible to square the circle. They didn't even think, they just thought you need the proper tool set. But when apparently somebody came out and said, well, no, their circles actually have this very unique property where they're, I can't recall it off the top of my head, but in essence, it was actually due to further mathematical work where it was proven that no, such a thing was impossible, and it wasn't something that was considered trivial or obvious to people beforehand. So the reason why Locke brings up the idea that if you have a first cause, it must, bear all those properties is for the following reasons. If you can bring about something from nothing, then I think that would take a tremendous amount of power. Because you're necessarily actualizing something without the use of anything else. It's just your own will. And I dare say that that's quite powerful. It would have to be, what else did he mention? He also mentioned free will. Well, if such a being didn't have free will, let's assume it even had a compatibilistic notion of free will where it needs to be caused into doing something, well, then the universe itself, that cause would always be timeless too. So something would be causing the eternal cause forever, and that would necessitate the creation of the universe. But if it would necessitate the creation of the universe forever, that would necessitate a universe without a beginning, in which case you're kind of back to the problem of being proven wrong since you already disproved the beginning of the universe or you already proved the beginning of the universe at that stage. So that's why libertarian free will is usually marshaled in at that stage as a necessity. Not necessarily for human beings. It's possible human beings could lack free will, but this cause doesn't. And then you also have, what other properties did he mention? Things like timelessness and immateriality. Since obviously those exist alongside time, and of course you're showing that all those things never began, then if this creator had those properties, then that creator would also have a beginning, in which case you're just moving it back one step. So you use this kind of conceptual analysis to show why this being has properties which are, if not, if it doesn't make it a deity, then it makes it very resemblant to a deity. I think the only kind of property you can't really get is God's omnibenevolence, for example, because you could have a immoral uncaused. There's nothing wrong with saying this God is immoral, but also can bring about a universe from nothing.
Well, so maybe not a god, but from our perspective, if it's true, we would think of it as a god.
Like Plato's idea of a demiurge, for example. A being that is kind of godlike, super powerful, can even meld the universe in together and hold it together, but not necessarily, a perfect being who is above and beyond all creation and is incredibly wise and moral, something like that.
So, Eliakai, I know you have limited time here. Would you like to jump in?
So I was sort of listening to see where you guys were going with a number of things, because as I said, I didn't get a chance to actually watch the video before I got in, or I said that kind of, I guess, before we got on stream. So my issue with a number of people who say that the Kalam cosmological argument specifically argues in favor of deity is that there are other potential causes other than deity for the beginning of the universe. There is scientific evidence that the universe began. And, I'm sure that Dragnot could probably go over it significantly better than I could, but across, astrophysics in particular, there's arguments for the expansion of the universe from a singular point, and a certain amount of evidence also about the speed at which celestial bodies are traveling and what we are able to view in the sky through telescopes and such, and the way that what we are witnessing would be affected by, for example, the speed of light and how it travels. So I very much am of the belief, given the evidence I've seen, that there is a first cause of some sort. Whether or not it absolutely must be deity, even though I am a theist, I don't necessarily think it does. And I'm trying to get my thoughts together on how exactly... Max actually did a very good job of explaining chaos earlier. But chaos is one of the Greek conceptions, and it's very similar to some of the things that I've read about, like quantum physics and destabilizing force and things seemingly appearing from nothing because of fluctuations. But chaos effectively is this eternal, constantly mutable state through which anything could emerge. And for all we know, like, the universe could have emerged fully formed with everybody's memories all intact and all of this evidence still there from a state like that. But, I mean, I think that chaos is more in favor of something like the Big Bang than it is specifically an argument for deity. So that's my position, as best I can express it at the moment. I've been dealing with stuff all day, so forgive me if I'm not at the top of my game.
No, you're all right. Anybody, just, free for all.
Max kind of gave a really good layout of the of how Kalam is presented and what are the kind of initial conclusions of the Kalam argument. What I would like to kind of do here is point out what are all of the assumptions that are, well, I can't do all of them, but at least some of the assumptions that are in there. So first of all, we're talking about causation. Everything that happens, everything that begins to happen, every event has a counterfactual cause. But not for this thing, this event would not happen, right? And in the argument of Kalam, it is presented so that if you go back and back and back and back, you will eventually have to come to the first cause, which itself cannot be caused because it is first. So either it came into being uncaused or it has always been there eternally. Obviously, the argument is that it is eternal. The assumption is, first of all, that everything needs to have a cause. That we cannot have an infinite regress, which is what Malpass pointed out. But there's another assumption which kind of sneaks in there, and that is that there is a singular cause. And that's what Aliakai, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong.
Just call me Ali if you have a hard time with my name, Ali, but it's Aliakai.
Yeah. It is pointing out with chaos that you can have a multitude of first causes, that there is no real reason, there is no counterfactual stating that there needs to be one singular cause, except if you say it's first, then it has to be one. I have never gotten anybody to kind of give me a proper argument why there has to be one. Nothing that we have happen has only one cause, right?
Well, thank you, by the way, Barney, for explaining that part, because that was part of what I was having a hard time articulating, was that you don't have to have a single event, that there could potentially have been multiple, chains of things that happened all at once, and we would have no way of knowing that.
Yes.
Isn't the typical defense usually Occam's razor? Why posit a multiplicity of causes when one just suffices?
Isn't Occam's razor ultimately an appeal to intuition, however?
It usually depends on how it's phrased, because different philosophers give different justifications for Occam's razor, funnily enough. So one person could say that, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Swinburne, but one is a probabilistic justification, which says, okay, if you have to posit more entities that are needless, then the more entities you posit, the less likelier such a scenario is to happen. Because not only are you saying one has to be there to do it, but then two, when one could have sufficed, and that adds that makes it a little more probable or less probable than three, then four, then five. The
argument that I made was not necessarily for the existence of my deities. What I was talking about specifically was with chaos.
Not necessarily. Okay, well, I suppose if you chaos simplicator or God in chaos or
chaos as the original state, effectively. That, you know, there is a certain level of eternalism to the concept of chaos. I've heard a number of people compare chaos to the state of the singularity in the Big Bang, and that was the comparison I was drawing.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, I thought you were bringing in polytheism, or putting in polytheism as the alternative. Never mind.
No, like, I am a polytheist, but like, I have repeatedly stated that I cannot officially determine if my gods created everything, or if they had a hand in shaping it, or what particular position they had in those things.
Right. From my understanding of, you know, chaos or prime matter, when it comes to it as an entity, it's usually something that's only instantiated insofar as that there's something actualizing. There's something which can merge it with a form, like a formal cause, and then when the two come together, you have an entity. So you have prime matter, you have a form, a primary form. Then it comes together to form a being or a substance. So human beings are a rational animal. Like, that's Aristotle's definition. I'm not defending that, but I'll go with it for the sake of example. That is the form of what a human being is. Now, when a form is brought in with some kind of matter, then what happens is that essence or form and that chaos come together and they shape it into, you know, a full substance. And the reason why matter or chaos is necessary is what's called the principle of individuation. So all our essences as human beings, as rational animals, are identical, and yet we seem to be very different. So if we need something to differentiate us, then it's the matter. I'm a set of matter that exists here as a human being. You're one that exists over there, and so on and so forth. But prime matter on its own was usually without anything to, without it merging into anything else, tends to just go into nothing. Am I going over time?
Yeah, no, not at all.
I would like to hear Barney finish what he was trying to say, but my response to that, first off, was that I'm not particularly fond of the concepts of the forms. I think that Aristotle did a very good job of breaking down a number of the problems with them, particularly with the form of good or virtue in Nicomachean Ethics. Effectively, this idea that because of the multiplicity in which the way these words are used, this idea that language itself can somehow be considered to be representative of an absolute form of something. What makes something absolutely a bird? We can argue about taxonomical classification, but ultimately, what intuitively gives something birdness, or what intuitively gives something, say, virtue-ness or goodness, is so incredibly nuanced and complex and varied across cultures that the concept of an overarching form is not something that I necessarily agree with. However, the way that I've seen chaos used before was this concept that a deity could have emerged from it spontaneously, that there didn't necessarily have to be a form for something to cast into. And whether I'm arguing about a deity emerging from it or the universe emerging from it, my argument here is that the concept of chaos having a potential of having existed eternally itself is an option outside of a singular first cause. That was what I was stating. I wasn't stating it was the absolute, but that it is an alternative.
Oh, I see.
Real quick before you go on from there, and then like Aliakai said, we want to let Barney finish up with what he was doing, but that collective, that drop in the collective IQ of the community that everybody just felt is because Sky Out is now in the live chat. I just want to say hi, Sky Out. Go ahead, Max.
Oh, just to clarify something, when I was mentioning the form, I wasn't mentioning the form as in the Platonic idea. I was mentioning the form as in Aristotle's formal cause, as he mentions in the Metaphysics.
Fair.
And as to chaos, another issue with that would be that if chaos is not a being that has an intelligence or free will, then you kind of run into the other issue where why isn't it the fact that chaos just sustains the creation of the deity or the universe from eternity? If it's something that exists with, if it's something that requires its own set of infinity, like it exists over a period of time, then you kind of go from asking the question of, a set of events in the universe to the set of events in the universe and beyond into the chaos itself. Unless, chaos doesn't have any temporal properties. At least as you would conceive of it for the alternative hypothesis.
Well, I mean, I conceive of it very similar to the B theory of time, that effectively, because of a number of things that we understand from relativity, as per the B theory of time, time itself is an illusion.
Well, and that was something that Professor Lockett said in the video, that infinite regress is not possible, and I'm paraphrasing him here, because the number of past events must be finite because of certain necessary truths. What did you think of that, Barney?
I think that's very unfounded, and that's kind of what Malpass was trying to point out.
Right.
So yes, it is reasonable to think so if you think only within the constraints of our cognition, of our experience, of kind of classical philosophical thinking. We have seen these things are intuitive to us, this logic works for us, therefore it must have always been so, and it must always be so. But we are talking about a regime which is drastically different from anything that we could have possibly experienced. We're talking about a regime in which either a singular thing exists or an eternal thing exists, which is not something that we can evidence to. We are talking about a concept outside of time and space, which is something that is completely unavailable to our understanding and cognition about causation, about any of the essential elements of the argument, right?
Well, I mean, part of that is, can you conceptualize nothing?
Yeah, and in that philosophical sense, you really can't. But so, to be honest, in this argument, nothingness really doesn't come into it. In the Kalam argument as presented by Locke, by Andrew, there was never nothing, right? Even that first prime uncaused cause is eternal. It was always there. There was always something. There was that cause.
Right. This is the static view of time, if I'm not mistaken, Barney.
I'm
technically, I've heard that some theistic. I was just saying some theistic conceptions are compatible with the B theory of time, but most of this argument is based on like static time.
So the difference between static and dynamic time is basically the same difference, as I understand it, as A theory of time and B theory of time. Whether it is only present that exists and past and the future, the past no longer exists and future doesn't exist yet, or all of time exists, kind of coexists, and we are traveling through it as one dimension of motion. Right.
A third theory is the growing block that says the past and the present exist, but we're growing into the future, which it's the one everyone forgets, but I actually think it's quite nice too. Best of both worlds. But yeah, no, the B theory of time is very compatible with theism. Although I do want to ask the question about nothing, since that was brought up. Like, we got to be very careful not to reify what nothing.
Yes.
Reify nothing. It's nothing is not a thing which we're referencing. It's not something, but rather nothing would be us conceptualizing the non-existence of anything. So really, it's the absence of anything, not some kind of state. Because even saying a state is a thing, but rather it would be better to say it in an apophatic sense. It is the non-existence.
Like get into Ein Sof or.
basically. But yeah, I do tend to think this is pretty much the best way. All existence, yeah, nothing is the absence of anything existing.
Okay, so I would like to stray away from nothing because I still think that nothing was not mentioned anywhere in any of the arguments presented. So I kind of really do believe that it's not relevant to the conversation. One thing, Max, one thing that I wanted to push back on, you said that the singular first cause could be justified by Occam's razor. And I think that that's a misunderstanding of Occam's razor. Mm-hmm. Occam's razor dictates that we keep things as simple as possible, but that does not mean that we restrict things to the least possible number of entities. The example that's usually given is when you hear hoofs, you think horses, not zebras, if horses are prevalent where you live. But consider this. You hear 8 hooves behind a corner, right?
Right.
By Occam's razor, should you assume 2 horses, or should you assume Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, which is just one entity?
Sleipnir would be pretty cool there. But no, we would assume the existence of horses because because not only does it require you to not believe in bring in an extra being into existence, but we've had more experiences with 2 horses than we ever have with Odin's horse, for example.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
No.
So adding in Sleipnir is adding in one entity and one entire new realm of existence and mode of existence through Norse mythological, right? Supernatural existence. So in that sense, we know that fields exist and that fields fluctuate in uncertain way in quantum physics. So that could be the multitude of things that exist, and that's actually been proposed, right? And that out of those fluctuations, you get the creation of particles,
right?
The creation of the universe.
Right. So I would agree with you. Like if we were comparing it between like one creator god and a multiverse, well, we already know one multiverse exists. So that's fair. That Occam's razor isn't going to be preferable. Occam's razor isn't going to make any dictations. It isn't going to save theism on that one. However,
wait. We already know one multiverse exists.
One universe exists.
One universe.
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry if I misspoke. However, the reason I brought that up, because I was under the assumption that we were comparing it between theism and polytheism. So it's not really a matter of of bringing in a different kind of being, but one different kind of being or a multitude of a different kind of being. Because if we've only heard horse hooves for the first time and we couldn't really decipher the number, chances are we would probably only bring in one horse rather than a multitude of horses.
But even in that case, I don't think your argument works, because what you're bringing about by invoking the divine first cause, it's not the being that you're bringing about, it's the mode of existence, right?
Right.
The entity that you're bringing into it is the mode of existence. There are such things as divine, personal, intelligent, free-willed creators that exist for an eternity and act as the first cause. Now, whether there is one or whether there is many is not a thing that we can say. It's not a thing that you can deductively conclude from that argument. So I don't think Occam razor helps you there. It is.
Well, I'm not right. So in terms of bringing in Occam's razor, I'm not using it as kind of like a deductive certainty. Of course, Occam's razor is never never going to provide you with certainty. Who knows? There could be. Who knows? Maybe the thief who robbed your house might have brought a friend along who did nothing. It's possible.
Well, Max,
just to finish up, it's possible that the thief brought his friend along who did nothing. It's not as likely, but it's possible. And likewise, I'm only bringing in Occam's razor not as a way of, discounting polytheism, because it could be possible that a multitude of gods caused the universe to start beginning. But compare that to just one god. What is more likely, not what is certain or possible in a deductive sense.
Go ahead, Alika.
Well, all I was going to say was I don't want to get into a deep epistemological argument, but if you're going to start from the premise that gods exist at all, given the way that religion has evolved throughout time, we have more evidence that religion, like that polytheistic religion, has existed longer, and that the perception of gods has been multitudinous for the longest part of human history. So in terms of Occam's razor, if you're going to use that sort of argument, it's more likely that there are multiple gods than one single. Whether that singular god cause, is like whether that is a single god who caused and then created the other deities, or birthed them, or whatever you want to call it, is inconsequential there.
Right. So if we're going to explain not just the beginning of the universe, but the beginning of the universe and the existence of world religions, then polytheism would actually be preferable. However, what we're just discussing is the creation of the universe itself. It's quite possible that there's a creator god, a prime mover, only one, and world religion has nothing to do with it. In fact, one could even accept the Kalam and just be a deist or of an Aristotelian variety or something, and not necessarily be involved in world religions.
As a positive atheist, I can agree with the initial argument of the Kalam, right?
Right.
Assuming that everything that begins to have a cause, everything that begins to exist has a cause, there must necessarily be a first cause, right? Or the universe began to exist, there must be a cause to. I agree with that part of the argument just fine. And if you're willing to kind of whip out a sticker and write God on it, and then go to the beginning of the universe and stick that on whatever is the cause, then I will even agree with you that there is a God. At least
that'd be effectively a deistic God.
Presuming there is a beginning that we can pinpoint.
Barney was granting it for the sake of argument, though.
Yeah.
No, I quite literally mean it. The thing is that I don't consider that to be a God, right? If that cause is quantum fluctuations, you can label it God as the first cause, but I would not consider that a God.
Right, and then that comes to the next discussion point, whether such a being would be, have agency, whether, it could think, had free will, could decide whether or not it wanted to create the universe or not. And that's kind of another argument that's usually brought up. So assume that the argument is in itself not, so assume for the sake of argument that the first cause doesn't have any agency. Then it's just without any thought causing the universe to exist. But if that creature existed from eternity or wasn't temporal, then it would always be creating the universe, in which case the universe didn't have a beginning. But that would kind of violate the first premise, which was already established. The second premise, which was already established. So there's that issue as well.
So that again, I would call that was the second on my list of unwarranted assumptions. Right. So Locke says that being needs to be eternally changeless and has to have free will, because it must have existed for an eternity without causing the universe, and then at some point chosen arbitrarily to create the universe and therefore be the cause. Well, sorry, you have thrown in an assumption that it has to exist eternally without creating universes. Why couldn't it have always in its eternal existence been creating universes, watching them unfold, or being there while they unfold, and then when they expire or parallel with them, create another universe and another universe and another universe, and have that be a part of its nature of existence?
That's
eternal existence.
And that's the argument that I would make, Barney, is that the property of this entity, whatever it is simply to make universes. It does nothing else. And so once that universe goes to heat death, well, guess what? It makes another universe. Like it doesn't necessarily have to depend on the universe dying. That could be one of the aspects to it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has agency, because the only agents that we know are human agents in this case, that the ones that can make these, conscious decisions to do things other than react. But I kind of see a bit of a bootstrapping with some of these other qualities. And then that's kind of what kind of confused me with Dr. Luke's position as far as this entity that exists. It exists outside time, and it can somehow change and make decisions outside of time, which doesn't seem all that possible. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. How exactly is he adding these secondary traits to whatever this thing is that's at the initial cause, right? Other than saying that creating a universe is simply a property of itself and then full stop.
Right. So in terms of, this model where you have a being who just for eternity just creates universes and they succumb to heat death, and then another one is created. You have this very cyclical model where time kind of manifests itself as being, a circle. But one could always just imagine, like a clock, that's eternal, that's going on forever. And the problem with this the problem with that is it kind of goes back to the second premise when Locke justifies it with with his principle that it's impossible to have a past eternity. The problem with that is if there's a past eternity of universes just being summoned, created, and then destroyed, then that kind of violates the argument he was making with the second premise. So since that's already established, then it kind of also rules out an impossibility of circular creation and destruction.
Why?
So you're talking about. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
To respond to the question of why, so the second premise establishes that it's impossible for an infinite past because, and Locke goes into like 4 reasons why, but I'm not going to touch on that. If we're granting that for the sake of argument, the second premise, then it also stems that a God who creates a universe from past eternity would also be impossible too, because that would mean that there's a God who's instantiating, an infinite series of creation. But since an infinite past series is impossible per the second premise, then that's not a viable model.
But no, so there is one eternal first cause.
Okay.
The word first is misleading there. One eternal foundational cause, right? Okay. Because that is the basis of foundationalism, from which everything that exists and everything that existed and everything that will exist draws its existence. This entity is necessarily indestructible and unchanging, right?
Right.
That those are the arguments that I'm fully willing to accept if we accept the infinite regress as an impossibility and kind of maintain our logic and reason such as they are. This is not that case, right? That right. Thing which statically, unchangingly exists is constantly, throughout an eternity, creating and destroying universes, or causing universes to be created and unfold. Whether they are created contemporaneously or not is actually irrelevant to the argument. It doesn't have to wait for the universe to be destroyed to create the next one.
Right.
Maybe there's this being. Maybe there's this being that has an infinite number of universes in mason jars on a shelf in its bedroom, like sea monkeys.
Well, I was thinking more so.
One thing to point out when we use the word being in this context, it is that amorphous meaning of a thing that exists. It doesn't have to be a creature. It doesn't have to be a person. It doesn't have to be a god. It is something that exists.
So the kind of the way that I think about it. If you want to posit some type of initial mover, I'm fine with that. But if we're going to say that, well, God exists in the, I guess, the Christian version, that this thing is unchanging, it's unmoving, it has a will of its own, and okay, if that is how, or some of you folks want to depict that.
How can
something that have free will be unmoving?
Precisely, was just about to say that.
Yeah. And real quick, I want to
seem so contradictory to me.
Yeah, real quick, Barney. Before going, I just want to give Aliakai the opportunity to. She said she could only be here for about an hour because she has a class. I don't know if it was getting close to the time you had to leave, Allie.
It's an online class, so I can be here up until maybe about 5 minutes after 6 my time. So I've got maybe another 10 minutes at the most.
Okay.
So yeah, like I don't have to go anywhere for it. I just have to hop into the class chat, and I already let my teacher know that I'd be a little bit late because I had a YouTube discussion that I was doing. He knows about this stuff.
So
all right, I'll remember that, and I'll cut back in. About 6:04 to let you say goodbye. Go ahead.
Yeah, we need to nix that property then. Yeah, that we'll nix them. We'll just say this entity is atemporal. It exists solely to create universes, a la the Hilbert Hotel manager of universes, and so that's all it does. It just perpetually creates universes. So,
well, and explain that you posted in the internal chat something that Alex Malpass had said.
Oh. Yeah, so I was talking to Alex because I was trying to understand where Dr. Look was coming from, and I had misapprehended something in respect to the position in which his God inserts the creation of the universe. So anyway, this is a direct quote from Dr. Malpass about Dr. Loke's position. He is saying that if the past was infinite, then God could have made a hotel room at each moment and added it to a hotel, making a Hilbert's hotel in the present, which is impossible. And so that's Alex's kind of depiction of what's going on here with Dr. Loke's argument. And so just trying to understand that in light of the other kind of little factoids that we have about this entity, right? And because that's I think this was about halfway through the conversation, because they had kind of skipped over, okay, well, fine, this entity, we're going to skip over the infinite regress thing and go straight to this. So how is this an issue?
I don't know. It's not.
That's probably the hard part for me. How is this an issue? If we're talking about something that's infinite, right? When I first heard Dr. Loke's position, when he wanted to insert a God, I think times 0, t equals 0. That's where God exists. After that, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, all the way to positive infinity, right? So the issue with my depiction of what I think Dr. Loke is saying is that my conception of infinity exists from negative infinity through 0 to positive infinity. So there exists no place for his deity to actually operate it, except if this entity is a perpetual universe creating machine, then that's what it always does. And that's when we get to the analogy of the train cars moving. They're all moving, they're all pulling one another. And same with the loaners of money, right? We can argue, we can quibble over where the money came from, but how is it an issue that the money is being exchanged? No one can generate their own money, fine, but they're all loaning from one another. So where's the issue?
What then becomes the base? Then you have to ask the question: what becomes the basis of money? Like, if it's just a bunch of paper that everyone's throwing around.
Right. So
that's not part of the.
Yeah, I could explain the concept of like how money works, but I mean that's not really part of the argument being made here.
It's in relation to the cause of the universe causing everything that is now. So from t equals 0 to what everything that we have now, every cause and effect subsequent from that event. That's what it's supposed to be analogous to, and I left that out. I apologize.
I see. But in terms of the money, example, I think what he's trying to get at is what the principle of proportionate causality, which basically means that if we accept the principle that from nothing, nothing comes, then everything which exists now existed in some way in the past. So, for example, if I have a cell phone in my hand currently. Like all the parts of said cell phone came together from disparate parts of the world, and then they were brought in together into one kind of entity. So this cell phone had kind of a pre-existence. Now those parts formed from other processes which had, I don't know, the same quantity of existence themselves, and so on and so on. But if you have an eternal regress of things just providing existence for other things, then it would then follow that everyone gets its existence from basically nowhere. And if that's the case, then how did we ever come up to this point? I think that if I could charitably depict Locke's argument, maybe that's what he's getting at.
Yeah, so I kind of agree with you. Well, I think that that's what he's getting at. If there is no money, then no money can be created in an infinite chain in which nobody has any money, right? Agreed. His argument for the first cause is basically stating that if there is no first cause, then nothing can exist. Well, you're presupposing the first cause, right? If there is money anywhere in an infinite chain, then that money can be circulated around infinitely. They were using an analogy with the train, right? If all the carts are standing still, then they are all standing still. If any of them is moving, then if the carts are moving, then they are all pulling each other. Whether it's an infinite chain or there is a first mover doesn't really matter. And he kind of tried to defeat that by saying, well, we are not all in perpetual existence. We do not all exist throughout all time. But you can make the analogy work even that way.
Well,
if there is some movement in any of the carts in an infinite chain, then all of the carts will eventually begin to move and stop to move, right?
Well,
Progress. Go ahead.
Just real quick, because you said you can't have we don't all exist all throughout time, but he did say in there though that he makes an exception for his God that he says created the universe, because he said that his God has the lack of capacity to begin to exist. And he seemed like, to him, the way I took it was he kind of felt that was like a silver bullet, for the argument. And he said that it must be a being that did not begin to exist, that has the quality of beginninglessness. And that was one of the assumptions he was making that I couldn't accept. So, when you say we haven't all existed forever, well, he's saying that his prime mover existed forever.
Well, he doesn't. Well, he's saying that his prime mover exists eternally, not infinitely. And the distinction there is when the prime mover exists for eternity, he doesn't exist in time and at every event in time, but rather he exists outside of the bounds of time, and he's also the creator of the universe, which includes time, matter, and energy.
Well, so, help me to understand though, because as the resident idiot in the room, why isn't that the same problem of infinite regress?
What I think John is trying to ask is, isn't God also money in that example? Why is there God in that infinity of time or infinity of chains of events?
Right.
In his eternal existence. Where did God come from?
God. Oh, I mean, if he's timeless, then he wouldn't need a cause of existence, because the first premise is anything which begins to exist has a cause. But if God doesn't begin to exist, then there's no necessity for a cause or no necessity for an explanation.
Well, yes,
And
that's precisely it. If there is some money in an infinite chain, then everybody can borrow that money from each other.
Thank you. And that's kind of like, so if we're saying that this arena has this entity, whatever it may be, this space has the property of creating a universe, right? Then I can imbue it with the power of also putting momentum into a train car after it's done creating however many train cars, infinite, that it needs to create train cars, or an infinite number of money borrowers. Every so often, it will arbitrarily generate money, right? So I can imbue these concepts with, you know, the most, I guess, idyllic circumstances. But so how do we parse which one of these is, I guess, the most conceptually sound, I guess I could say. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and here's the thing, though, and what I was getting at a minute ago, and thank you, Barney, you were right. That's, you know, as far as what you thought I was trying to ask, that's where it fit in was, you know, why, you know, same as the money in the analogy. But what I can't get past is why is, okay, so if this prime mover has the quality of beginninglessness, never had a beginning, why isn't that special pleading? Because it's the same problem of infinite regress. And before any of you answer, I want to give Aleakai a chance to say goodbye.
Alrighty, I'm sorry I wasn't able to contribute as much as I'd liked. Again, I kind of didn't even realize I'd gotten the video sent until like 20 minutes before the stream. I've been in and out of moderator meetings today. I had the stream with Naka this morning, and I had a bunch of classwork to do. So I hope that you guys enjoyed what I did get to contribute. So I do have to head out because I've got class in about 2 minutes, and they're already nagging me to get in there. So I'm one of the co-hosts of Polyology. We're actually going to be doing a stream tomorrow for any of you guys that aren't familiar with us on some common sort of fundamentalist arguments that we get. And it's going to be the 5 members of Polyology. A little later on, we're going to be joined by Wolf the Red, and What the Craft, also known as Witch, is also going to be like there with us. So if you guys want to come join us to do that, it'll be at 3 p.m. PST, 6 p.m. EST. And I would look forward to joining you guys there. Thank you for having me. And like I said, I hope I did get to add something.
Oh, you did, Allie. Absolutely. And thank you so much for doing this for me.
No problem. It was kind of last minute, like I said, so I didn't get an adequate chance to repair. I'm hoping I'll be able to do better. But it's nice to actually get to discuss philosophy sort of this in depth. It's super enjoyable. I haven't gotten a chance to do that in quite some time.
Yeah, and definitely, folks, check out Polyology. We'll get all the guest info in a pinned comment when this post is a video. So again, to the rest of the panel, why isn't it special pleading to say the prime mover has this quality of beginninglessness? I mean, it's the same. It's almost the same problem of infinite regress.
Because the universe exists within segments of. Because the universe exists within time, and because it exists within time, it is past infinite. There is a literal infinite quality of things. Whereas if this, one creator who exists outside of time isn't bound by time, is timeless, then there's really no past infinite you have to explain with him. And he doesn't succumb to the same difficulties the universe would.
If I may play a bit of a devil's advocate, or in this case, God's advocate, it is special pleading, but the case that we are discussing necessitates special pleading. No matter what you bring in there will require special pleading, right? We are talking about a very special case, and if we are allowing that there is a first cause of any kind in any mode of causation, that first cause is a special case. However, Occam's razor, you should keep that special pleading to a minimum. You don't get to say, well, I'm special pleading for this, therefore I can special plead for anything that I want.
Yeah, I would have to definitely agree with Max and Barney on this. Like, it is, and I've seen this, it is somewhat special pleading. You could, I guess it's depicted as special pleading, but once you agree to that first premise, which some people don't, you inherently, I'll use the word, imbue that first cause, whatever it is, whatever you want to name it, with special properties. And so because of those special properties, it has to stand out necessarily from each and every subsequent cause, effect, or anything that it deals with.
Right.
And you'll hear kind of what I call bootstrapping later of secondary traits that allow it to do the things that it does.
So I wouldn't even call it special pleading, because pleading requires you to do it for an arbitrary reason. But I think, as Barney quite aptly pointed out, that because this being would be, something radically different from the universe itself, then we'd expect something, very special in terms of properties, whatever that might mean.
Yeah,
for me, the special pleading, which is used to constrain our knowledge of that thing, which is used to kind of say, oh, it's this one thing, is misguided. It kind of violates our epistemic limits. We don't know, but if we special plead in this way, we can conclude that this. No, there is special pleading necessary, but that special pleading kind of opens up the possibilities. If you open the door to violating our usual logic and reasoning about causation in space-time, you are opening up the doors to an infinity of possibilities, of which God is one. And while I agree that God which is presented is a sufficient cause, right? It is not necessary. It is not necessarily that one cause. It is not necessarily God that is cause. So you kind of first need to manifest a God, and then we can have an argument whether or not that God is a candidate for being the first cause.
Wait, why do you have to manifest? I mean, is it not possible to get reason from the effect to the nature of the cause? Like, even, for example, when you have forensic scientists who are at a crime scene, they themselves can manifest. They themselves don't have to manifest the criminal before, going and finding clues about what the criminal would have to be, considering the residual evidence.
Well, because if you don't manifest the God, though, then all you can do is make an argument and establish a probability.
Yeah, but even establishing a probability definitely is a form of knowledge, and it kind of we wouldn't say that, well, you haven't manifested the criminal, so all that you've done is worthless. No, you've at least given us, first good steps to manifesting one, and even if the case is unsolvable, given all our background evidence, you've at least told us who would have been most likely to have done it.
Wait. Okay, what might have been most likely? Okay, but if you take criminal and replace that with cause of the universe, okay, when a forensic scientist, examines a crime scene, they can point to a criminal, but they don't know who that criminal is necessarily. Okay, here, you can point to a cause of the universe, but to say that it's a God is the same thing as, a forensic scientist examining crime scene and then arbitrarily pointing at an individual and saying he did it, without all the proper
I think, right, but the forensic scientist, he has a list of suspects who would have been likely to have committed the crime, and they usually just use their science to establish which suspect was the most likely culprit. Now, it wasn't to say that they knew originally who the criminal was before doing anything. They just manifested the likeliness and the probability of it. And on some situations, they would have at least helped the police to know who to look for or what to look for.
Yes, but Max, I agree with you. And there is a point of if you can deduce to one certain thing, sure. If you have evidence that supports your claim, sure. But you do not get to accuse somebody based on a philosophical argument with uncertainty and assumptions without presenting physical evidence of the crime, right? Even like Yes, if somebody was stabbed with a knife and knives get held by humans, you can deduce that a human was the murderer or committed the killing. It could have been a suicide. It could have been, but there are certain there are certain circumstances where you can deduce something.
You could use an abstract argument.
Yeah. However, and Andrew kind of says, "Well, I have arrived at all of this deductively," where he really hasn't. He has arrived at very few things deductively. He has assumed many things without speaking them out loud. Mm-hmm. He has assigned probabilities without discussing them or justifying them, and then after presenting everything, has concluded that everything that he has said, he has arrived to deductively. No, you haven't. You really haven't.
All right. So right? Just to go, all right, but just to touch on the analogy, the only thing I was claiming was, and I recognize that there are differences between something more abductive as a forensic science and something more deductive, like, you know, the exercise Andrew is doing. But the point is, you could still go from the effect to the cause. That's the only thing, and I was just using those two disciplines to establish that. Now, when it comes to the difference between, you know, the forensic science and metaphysics, which is what Andrew was getting, which was what Andrew was participating in, the reason why forensic scientists look for physical evidence to establish something is because it's a physical discipline. Whereas metaphysics literally is above or comes after the physics. It's something which establishes as certain as possible metaphysical principles and then tries to deduce with as close to certainty as possible. Not even, you know, absolute certainty, but even even, you know, making a reasonable inference that God is that there is one cause of the universe, and that cause is going to be something like the God of classical theism. Not even the God of classical theism, but even something like that. And yeah, I don't think in principle such a thing goes against our epistemic limits. I just even if Andrew hasn't shown it, which I agree with you, he hasn't. I don't think the second premise is proven. I do think it is still a possible exercise.
It is a possible exercise. I agree with you entirely.
Yeah. All right.
So something that they alluded to, I took a note, and maybe you guys can help me understand this because it kind of went over my head. But Alex Malpass at one point said something to the professor about what Max had just brought up about metaphysics, that logical impossibility they were talking about, but it's hard to accept a metaphysical impossibility that unless you reduce it to like a physical ideation of I mean, I didn't really understand what he was saying there. I'm hoping that Barney or Drag or Max can explain that to me. I mean, he was basically was saying everything has to derive from our experiences. So when you talk about a metaphysical impossibility, you can't even conceive of it unless you break it down to, you know, the idea of the physical.
Yeah, that's what I was mentioning, trying to make an abductive argument, because when I hear people talk about agents, they're usually not making, in this case, not making an abductive argument, because you need a precedent, right? So if you're going to use abductive reasoning to come to a conclusion that whatever this entity is, you know, it possesses a mind and it possesses this and that quality. Well, when have we seen an atemporal entity that's outside of time, right? That we're positing something that none of us have any experience with. And I think it's interesting, and I think Dr. Malpass actually made a point about this earlier with causality. We're using, I guess, a familiar, a very, very tangible understanding of causality, right? That's kind of tied into materialism for something that is kind of outside of that purview. But it's kind of switch, right? When we're talking about how you're apprehending this entire scenario with respect to the agent, with respect to cause, with respect to what we expect from this supposed agent.
can I quickly make this? Can I quickly provide an example to help elucidate the distinction between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility?
Can
Certainly.
I just jump in with one short statement, like one sentence? What Dreg just said is precisely what I meant by saying that first you need to have a god for that god to be a possible culprit of the act. Go ahead, Max.
Oh, right. I was just going to bring up the distinction between logical and metaphysical possibility. So do I have to provide you guys any empirical evidence to show you that there is no such thing as a married bachelor?
No.
Oh,
No.
yeah, it's a contradiction in terms. So we all agree there. Now, let's... if you violate the law of logic, and if you violate the law of logic, excluded middle, non-contradiction identity, then you've committed a logical impossibility. Now, if I were to tell you guys that in my hand, I have... Actually, not even that. Do I have to also go across the universe to show you that there's no such thing as water, which is also H2, which is also not H2O? So water that is not H2O.
Water that's not. No, you wouldn't have to demonstrate that.
What is
Okay,
it called? What's it called, Dragnot? It's dihydride.
Oh, dihydrogen monoxide. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's actually a very interesting distinction, because notice there's no contradiction in saying I have water which is not H2O. You don't violate the law of contradiction. You don't violate the law of excluded middle. You don't violate the law of identity. And in fact, for up until recently, most people didn't even know what water was. You know, we only say water is H2O with the advent of modern science. So it's kind of interesting. We have an identity statement, water is H2O, which doesn't violate any of the laws of logic, but which we are reasonably certain the contrary is impossible. So that would be a prime example of, you know, a metaphysical impossibility. There is no such thing, water which is not H2O.
So in some sense, you are now confusing semantics with metaphysics and calling them the same, which is kind of wrong. Water is by definition H2O. Bachelor is by definition an unmarried man. If you just take a different meaning, for example, Bachelor of Science, you can have a married bachelor, no problem, right? So that's kind of our own categorization of things, that these things fall into this category and not into that category. Second thing, all of the examples that you have chosen are macro effects that fall under our everyday experiences, fall under classical physics and fall under classical logic, right? But we know that on a micro level, on a quantum level, there are absolutely violations of logic. Things which don't have their properties, or which have contradictory properties at the same time in an undetermined superposition, which are forbidden by classical logic, right? Yeah, and at the same time necessary according to those rules.
Right. So just to go on to the first statement, it's not a semantic one, because it was actually a non-trivial scientific discovery to find out that water was H2O. In fact, if you were to go back to ancient Greek ideas of what water was, some people thought that water was a basic element that wasn't even reducible to anything else. They were wrong. It's something,
but they also thought that liquor was a form of water.
At
that time, there were waters which were not H2O.
At that time, there were waters that were...
At the time before we discovered H2O and bound the definition to that one meaning, right? If you brew brandy, if you brew a spirit, that was fire water. Mm-hmm. Every liquid in ancient Greece was considered as the element of water.
Okay, that's actually interesting, and I had no idea about that. But I think the point still remains that science did rule out taxonomies of water which were wrong, and actually now push a taxonomy of water which is considered to be correct. So
yes,
the point
that is analytical. That is by definition. What is water?
Water is H2O. Well, as we understand now, water is H2O. Yeah.
So what is not water? Anything that's not H2O. So can something that's not H2O be water? No, that's semantics. That's not logic.
But well, I mean, semantics goes into. But
if I have a dog, I can name my dog Water, and at that point there exists water which is not H2O.
All right. Okay, I see what you're getting. No. Okay, I do get where you're coming from, but the point remains when people refer to water, they're referring to a kind of substance. It's not the word, it's the reference. And usually when they refer to water, it's usually a clear liquid. Before that, it was a clear liquidy substance that right. And after they did there was a scientific discovery that what people were referring to as water was H2O, you know, as soon as you distilled anything else from that. So I think what's being confused here is the semantic, you know, the word water and the substance which is referring to and what it essentially is and what it essentially has to be when we're thinking about it correctly.
Well, and Max, I believe that you brought that example and the Bachelor example up because you were leading to something else. So,
right, the Bachelor example was only to show the juxtaposition between the two things. One can just be shown by pointing out that when you say bachelor, you mean an unmarried. You mean somebody who is unmarried. And when you say married man, you're saying married. So that breaks the law of non-contradiction. Oh, and as to the whole physics thing, I think it's only, and you know, superposition. I think that's really only dependent upon what's called the Copenhagen interpretation. I think if you were to go with Sean Carroll and go with the multi-worlds view, then that would actually go right out of the water. And there are other kind of schools about quantum mechanics. Personally, I just think that personally, I'm more of the opinion that at this point we're just looking at probabilities. I don't really think anyone's necessarily, you know, committed to any entity at that level existing. I think that those are just helpful fictions at this point.
So while I agree with you that there are multiple interpretations of physics and that some of them conserve some things, all of them necessarily violate the laws of classical logic. Because they either violate locality or realism. So the Copenhagen is an example of violated realism, in the sense that a particle does not have a set value for its property until it is measured, until it interacts with that property. And things which preserve that, like a lot of people will call out to Bohmian mechanics, right, pilot wave theory, as a thing which preserves those properties. But then you lose locality. Then those properties are not in the thing that holds that has those properties. They are distributed throughout all of time and space and in every place. The blueness of my pencil on the table is also in the atoms of hydrogen circling a star in Andromeda, for right. So those in themselves are also contradictions, according to classical logic, classical philosophy, classical physics. Those things are necessarily mathematically violated.
So just
you can pick which one is violated, but one set of classical concepts is violated anyway.
Right. What couldn't be the case, though, that that's mostly an epistemic limit rather than a metaphysical commentary on it? Like, is it not possible that it's only when we see it that it's only a matter of our limits of our perception and our knowledge, rather than, you know, something that's metaphysically necessary in that entity? Or
because of the Bell experiment is the short answer to that. So the only way you could have both locality and realism is if you had hidden variables. If those things had their value permanently set and hidden from view in some way, we don't know how. And Bell basically came up with an ingenious way to to distinguish between hidden variables and undefined states. And it is experimentally proven that it is undefined states.
I see. So, out of curiosity, when it comes to superposition, that's, you know, something being at two places at once, right? Or
no, that is something having. So, superposition and entanglement is where you have a set value for a system of particles without having a set value for any of the particles, right? You know that the particles are in the state of one up and one down, but you don't know which one is which. And when you measure one, you will know the other because you know the value of the state. But at any given time, the value of each particle itself is undefined. It is not jittering between up and down. It is not random. It is not unknown to us. It is unset. It doesn't have a value.
I see. And as for realism, do you mean the entity's existence itself, as opposed to it being, you know, a helpful fiction, or do you mean something else?
So realism in physics is literally the assignment of a property, right?
Okay.
Position is a property. Color is a property. Momentum is a property. Values that you can ascribe to an object are the properties of that object. In classical physics, all of the properties of a thing are contained within that thing. If I have a blue pencil in my hand, the blueness of the pencil is in the pencil.
Right.
Right.
So
is it?
And non-realism is the statement that there is no blueness in the pencil whatsoever until you measure the blueness of the pencil, until you ask what color is the pencil, and then it suddenly acquires that property to answer that question. But there are contradictory statements which cannot be asked at the same time. I cannot at the same time ask what color is the pencil and how long is it, right?
I see. Is it possible that, you know, our very perception of the entity just brings it into existence? Just possibility. No, I'm not actually pushing this as a theory, but I'm just asking.
It depends. It depends on how far you go with epistemic uncertainty. Like if you go to the limits of philosophical debates about knowledge, we don't know anything in the strict analytical philosophical sense. Like when you talk about mathematics and you define x to be 1, you know absolutely that x is 1, right? In that sense, we know nothing about nature. There is no knowledge possible or available to us about nature.
Right.
And if you take that approach, then yes, anything is possible. But in that case, you can also say, well, it's possible that the laws of logic are just incidental and apparent, and that logic doesn't really exist. It's just happenstance. But like if you go that far into philosophical consideration, you lose all meaning.
Right. But I mean, but it definitely would seem to resolve it if, for example, you were to perceive it coming into existence. then then I don't think any law of classical logic would be violated, would it not? Because, it's just you perceiving something at its most fundamental level, that thing coming into existence, and from there on in, you have the object.
Yes, but then you get to coherence, right? That thing, for you to see it, has to have been caused by another thing, which has to have been caused by another thing, and that kind of connects all of the universe into one big whole that has to have existed.
Right. Okay. I wouldn't see anything wrong with that, as long as it didn't violate the law of classical logic.
So by observing something, you have manifested that everything exists.
Or at least that one.
And then that statement of, well, doesn't it just come into being when we observe it, loses all meaning.
Well,
I told people we weren't getting into the meta. I lied.
Yeah,
you liar.
Yeah, and I just want to jump back to, so Max, when you brought up the two analogous points about the difference between a bachelor and a married man, and the I forget what the second one was now that you and Barney kind of sussed out there. Oh, about
water H2O.
Yeah. You started all that because you were going to show the juxtaposition between logical impossibility and metaphysical impossibility.
Right. So the difference is logical possibility just stems from a contradiction being found. It's analytic, whereas metaphysical possibility revolves around not a logical principle being violated, but it revolves around whether basic presumptions you have to make in order for there to be coherency before you even begin. Like for example, the issue of denying causality. For example, if somebody was to deny, I'll actually give an example from classical philosophy. So, are you familiar with Parmenides?
The name, but that's it.
Oh, okay. So Parmenides argued that change was just illusory. So things didn't actually change. And he argued that anytime you perceive change, it wasn't really happening. So he denied any of that actually going to place. And rather than actually address his arguments, because he did provide some pretty interesting arguments for it, like he was to say, well, something can't come from nothing. When you say change is happening, you're essentially saying that there's a new state of being just coming into existence. And rather than adjust that kind of argument, people were like, I'm waving my hand right now. You could kind of see that, there's a change going on as it goes back and forth. What ended up happening was people just didn't really believe in it, and they thought they had good reason not to because, well, everyone presumes change is happening. Because when you tell somebody, hey, change doesn't exist, you're expecting the sound. You're expecting sound to change, to go into their mind, through their ear, in their mind, and change something. So that's kind of the difference. Logical possibility is about more or less specifically breaking a logical law, whereas metaphysical possibility is about what we have to presume in order to have rational discourse. There's nothing illogical about saying change is illusory, but in terms of how you interact with the world and what you presume, yeah, you have to take on board the idea that change is happening. Even on a B theory of time, there is actually still a notion of change that's going on, which is a succession of events that that neurologically we're structuring together. But even that change of events, but even time itself exists on a B theory as, kind of a property of space-time. So that would kind of be an example.
Basically, statements like nothing exists. That's not an illogical statement. There is nothing illogical about it. But if you sincerely give that statement, at that point, the conversation is over. There is nothing to talk about. There is no further reasonable conclusion that you can draw from that and contribute to the conversation, because there is no conversation, and there is no you, and there is no me, and right? You have destroyed
philosophical nothing.
Yeah. But the statement itself is not illogical. It is not contradictory to anything except our assumption that things exist, that there is such a thing as reality, that we all live. Another statement, right? We all share the same reality. Again, if you say that that is false, that's not a contradiction. That's just a conversation ender.
Another one is I'm the only one who exists, like just hard solipsism.
Yeah.
Not a logical contradiction, but why are you trying to talk with me right now? Like, you're just being delusional.
Universal skepticism, right? Those are not impossibilities. Those are just irrelevant. Not in the sense that you cannot consider them or think about them, but if you really do consider them, you're done.
Well, I mean, anytime everybody brings up solipsism, all I can hear in my head is Seitan Bruggencate. How do you know you're not a brain in a vat? How do you know you're not a brain? How do you know you're not a brain in a vat? The thing is the discussion of solipsism is good only if you are having a discussion of solipsism. The reason, the minute that you bring it up in any other discussion, you've ended the discussion as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
The original point that Max was kind of making is that there are statements. So if we discount those conversation enders, things which make the existence and the conversation metaphysically impossible, what remains has some constraints. And within those constraints, we can give out universal statements, some universal statements, which hold true necessarily throughout all of the universe. And my contention with the examples were just that they were not true logical examples, they were semantic examples. But yes, I know what you mean.
There's also something to be said for trying to say that there is no what was it he was trying to prove? There's also something to be said about trying to show that a past infinite is not metaphysically possible. Is also what was it? It is also not a past infinity of concrete things is not metaphysically possible. When you say something is not metaphysically possible, there's a really high bar for you to try to show it, especially if it's not obvious. There are mathematical systems that do show how it's logically consistent to have, an infinite regress or a concrete, not an infinite regress, infinity as like an abstract thing. But whether or not you want to accept those, reflecting reality, that's another question entirely. And we do use infinities, at least as a useful tool. So I'm trying to remember, but as one kind of example, what is this discipline where people measure the bottom of the ocean? Like, measure for tsunamis or something like that? People who usually do that have to infer that for the equation that the sea is infinitely deep. Now, no one believes that the sea is actually infinitely deep, but it's very useful to think about it that way because we have empirical evidence to the contrary. But whether or not those systems can work and is metaphysically possible, that requires kind of a bit of a burden of proof that if you were to accept that, there's no way to reasonably interlock with somebody. And that's pretty hard.
There are kind of necessary physical infinities, right? If you consider density as a physical property, the density in a black hole is necessarily infinite. That's why it's singularity. That's why it breaks mathematics.
That's why William Lane Craig brings in the distinction between what he calls a qualitative infinite and a quantitative infinite. A quantitative infinite is something you count out, like 1, 2, 3, and after some time you'd go infinitely long. You could add a cardinal to everything, whereas like something like density is more of a qualitative infinity. It's it's the state of being, like a thing, like saying infinitely bright or being infinitely small. Like it's very hard.
No, I was going to say something that they brought up in that video that kind of broke my brain, and we're way off topic, but this is so interesting. I forget. I think it was Malpass that brought it up, that when you talk about infinities, that mathematically there is as large an infinity of odd numbers as there is whole numbers, and I don't understand how you come to that conclusion.
Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive, but if you think about it, you're trying to think of it like a number line, but you're talking about an infinity, right? So if there's an infinite number, if there's an infinite sequence, right, and you split that sequence in half, it's still infinite. It's hard to think about, but it's still infinite either way you cut it. Because if you take 1 and divide it infinitely, well, how many sections do you have? An infinite section of 1.
Yeah, but I just don't understand. Like, you count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How could there be the same infinity of all the numbers as there is of just the odd numbers? Like, that's where I'm like breaking down.
Yeah, but there is also an equally large infinity of multiples of 10 and of multiples of a billion, right? The whole point is, if you make a number line which is truly infinite and put every number to it, you can make a 1-to-1 relation in each set from one to the other without ever running out of space.
Is it possible to have greater and smaller infinities?
Yes.
Yeah. Isn't that how it's resolved?
I would have to talk to a mathematician, but that may be the case. Because I think when we start talking about that sort of thing, we get into set theory, I think it is. Yeah, it's part of set theory.
Yeah. This is kind of why, it's very intuitive to accept what's called finitism, the idea that the only quantities of things which exists are finite. So you could have as high a number as possible, but it can't be infinity. That's concrete. I think the guy who pushed for that theory said something along the line of, God created finite qualities, quantities, all finite. God created all finite quantities. All infinite quantities are just systems of rules created by man. I don't think he might have been a believer. I think it was just something he said off the cuff. But this is why it has a very intuitive appeal to it.
So I think we're going to start wrapping it up here, and going back to the video. One last question I want to put to everybody is Professor Locke, is he just another flavor of presuppositionalism?
No.
Is that what his argument boiled down?
No. His argument is much. Actually, believe it or not, the Kalam cosmological argument was created by early Muslims. I think actually pre-Muslims. Actually, I think it was still. Max, you might have to correct me on that, but I want to say it was popularized by early Muslims, but it existed before them.
It was popularized by them, but the guy who actually tried to who actually pushed the argument forward was like a 4th century Arian Christian, if I recall. I'm trying to remember his name, but just give me a minute. The wiki will probably tell me. Let's see. Oh yeah, his name was, I'm going to mispronounce it, but Philipponus, John Philipponus. And he was the one who tried to show it, and then Al-Ghazali then took the argument and ran with it. And when he was debating Ibn Rashid, who was known as Averroes, Al-Ghazali wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which attacked Aristotle and his followers and said Aristotle was wrong on the idea of past infinities existing, and he used the Kalam as kind of an argument there. And then Ibn Rashid responded by writing The Incoherence of the Incoherence. And there was kind of a back and forth there. It was kind of funny.
So, but why isn't he a presuppositionalist with all the assumptions that we talked about he was making, to propose his argument?
Because that's not what presuppositionalism is. Everyone has presuppositions. If having presuppositions makes you okay, I shouldn't say everyone, but most people presume things at the outset of discussions.
No, I would agree with your original statement. We all have presuppositions. We all have necessary.
You know what? I would agree.
Even coherentists.
Yeah, well, those are you're thinking of properly basic beliefs, but
not only.
Yeah, I think that's what John's thinking about. But the reason I err on the side of caution with saying that is because I've said that before, and I've been browbeaten to death by people who claim that they don't have any presuppositions. Which, okay, fine. Like, so I said,
those people are wrong.
Most honest folks would say they possess some presuppositions in some form, sure.
Right, but the point is, like, having presuppositions isn't sufficient to make you a presuppositionalist. It's necessary, but not sufficient. Yes. What is sufficient is to target epistemic presuppositions and falsify competing worldviews as a means of conducting a defense of Christianity. That is the modus operandi of presuppositionalist apologetics. It is not merely using presuppositions or even having them, but rather attacking the presuppositions of other people as a means of defending your own faith. And before anyone says, well, doesn't that show that other people's worldviews are incoherent, doesn't prove yours? Yes, that's part of the problem of it. But again, that is the main distinction between a presuppositionalist apologist and someone who merely has presuppositions, or someone who just really presupposes things.
Well, one thing that I picked up on what you said that I'd have to disagree with, that proving somebody else's idea wrong doesn't necessarily prove your idea right. I mean, so,
That's what I said.
Oh, okay. I thought you said that. I thought you said the opposite. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I would say that Andrew is that Locke is kind of a victim of his bias, of his own bias. That his worldview, which includes his presuppositions, that he is not rigorous enough in asserting which of the statements and assumptions that he's making are well founded and which aren't. There is a part of his reasoning which is very sound and very, very valid, and it's okay, but he is assuming too much.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Look, I want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll give everybody a final word and plug whatever you have to plug. And I just want to say thank you to Dragnaut. Thank you to Barney for agreeing to be here, and thank you to Dragnaut when I told him that you were going to be here, and told him we were going to simply leave it up to the panel to decide on a topic. Once we congregated, Dragnaut suggested this conversation, and I want to thank him for that, and I want to thank him for finding Max and bringing him along. Very nice to meet you, Max, and you brought a lot to the table. It was very interesting. But let's just go right down the line here. Dragnaut, final words, and let us know where we can find you.
Most folks here know where you can find me. Dragnaut Silvis, my channel where I'm just doing stupid shit. But no, you can find me on a number of channels. I don't mind coming to folks' channels talking about science, philosophy, whatever you want to talk about. Bushcraft. me and Ozzy's favorite topic in the Moonlight. But no, thank you, definitely. If folks out there have an idea of something they want discussed, talk to Nakasuchi, talk to John, and more than likely we know some folks who want to discuss that. Yeah, I heard that Barney was going to be a part of this, so I said, you know what? I'm pretty sure Barney would have enjoyed this conversation between Malpass and Luke.
Very much so.
Yeah. I know you. I figured you love it, and so would Max. So I said, you know what? Yeah, these guys. I know these two guys, and Allie can definitely appreciate it, given her background as well. And so, John, I know you're interested in learning more about philosophy. So sure, let's have some time to sit down and learn and belt claims back and forth. So no, thank you, gentlemen and lady.
Yeah, and I'll definitely have to go back and rewatch this and learn a little more from. And Max, final words, and are you on social media or YouTuber? Let us know.
Well, I'm not going to divulge that information because I like being employed. So, John, I'd like to thank you for facilitating and for letting me ramble on a little bit. Thank you. Dreg, thank you for inviting me to this. Ali, if you come back and listen, thank you so much for being the other theist in the room. And Barney, thank you for providing a lot of the great pushback. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And Barney.
So, as a closing, I would like to address the closing of the debaters of Malpass and Locke. Like the basic difference between these two people in arguing their cases. Malpass, in his closing, gives a statement of, these arguments look ironclad and deductive on paper. And in that sense, like, he is pointing out everything that's strong in the arguments, and he goes through those things and kind of admits that he's just raising doubts and cannot really defend his position. While Andrew's closing is as follows. This first, something along the lines of, with what I've said so far, I just want to close with stating that this first cause is concrete, and it is a person that I can personally know. And like, his closure is like, everything that has been unfounded thus far is kind of overshadowed by the assertion in his final closing. I know that was the whole point of his presentation, but still.
And do you are you a YouTuber? Do you
So lately I've mostly been hanging out on Sean G's, which is a flat earth channel talking about physics of gravity and general relativity and epistemology and stuff like that. I do have my own channel, and I'm always open to having one-on-one with anybody online or offline on anybody's channel. But yeah, it's Barney Tierspell.
Oh, okay. So same as the name.
So the name, the channel, the Twitter, the Facebook, the everything is Barney Tierspell.
All right. Well, hey, again, thank you to all. Thank you to Allie, who had to leave early. Thank you to Nakasuchi for letting me do this. I am also known as the Amateur Conversationalist. I just started my channel like a month ago. Please go check that out. The last episode I did was with Nakasuchi, and we talked about his time as a slam poet, and that was a very interesting conversation. We're going to keep doing that once a week, just a one-on-one, talking to people, talking with people in the community, and talking about subjects that, you know, people may not think, things that people may not know about those individuals. And also on Saturday nights, I do a stream on the Great Debate Community Channel. We'll be doing a stream this Saturday, more on that later. And again, this was a very good conversation. I will have to go back and watch it again because a few spots broke my brain a little bit, and hopefully I will recover. This is the Nakasuchi channel, and please join us in the future.